Hello everyone. Today we're going to look at subjectivism or relativism. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, according to subjectivism, moral statements express beliefs. That is, moral statements are truth-apt, so this is a form of cognitivism. And furthermore, some moral statements are true. Now, there are many forms of subjectivism, but essentially what they have in common is that a claim that what makes moral statements true are the opinions, feelings, or attitudes of people. Moral statements are about the attitudes of people. Moral value isn't out there in the world, it's in our minds, and this is what makes moral statements true or false. So moral statements express beliefs about the opinions, feelings, or attitudes of people, and some of these statements are true. That's what's in common to all forms of subjectivism. Now, I first just want to make a note about terminology. In the past few videos when I've mentioned this view, I've called it subjectivism or relativism. It is often called relativism. From this point on, I won't call it relativism because I think that's a bit misleading. The objective-subjective distinction has to do with mind independence and mind dependence. Something is objective if its existence or properties are independent of anybody's mind. It is what it is no matter what anybody thinks about it. On the other hand, something is subjective if it's mind dependent. Its existence or properties depend on what people think about it. So the view that moral judgments are subjective is that they're in one way or another mind dependent. That's what subjectivism is all about. Now, relativism is entirely compatible with objectivism. Indeed, there are many things which are objectively relative. Consider motion. We know that motion is relative to your frame of reference. From the frame of reference of the Earth is still. From the frame of reference of Mars or the Sun, the Earth is moving. I think it's something like 30,000 meters per second relative to the Sun, I think. From the frame of reference of the centre of the galaxy, the Earth might be moving, I don't know, 100,000 meters per second, or whatever. Importantly, the question, how fast is it moving really? Well, there's simply no answer to that. That question just isn't coherent. We can only say how fast something is moving relative to a particular frame of reference, and there is no one true correct frame of reference. There are many frames of reference and they're all equally right. And this is an objective fact. This doesn't depend on our minds or feelings. Relativism is part of the objective structure of the world. So relativism doesn't entail subjectivism. It would be possible to be a moral relativist, but not a subjectivist. Furthermore, there are forms of subjectivism that aren't really relativist. We'll look at those a bit later. But the point is that the question of relativism versus universalism is quite different from subjectivism versus objectivism. To break it down, we'll be looking at four forms of subjectivism. First to relativist, second to non-relativist. In this video, we'll look at relativist subjectivism. And that's individualist subjectivism and cultural subjectivism. And then in the next video, we'll look at non-relativist subjectivism. Ideal observer theory and divine command theory will be the two I'll look at there. Okay, so individualist subjectivism, also sometimes called simple subjectivism or naive subjectivism or whatever. It goes many names for this. This is a view that moral statements are descriptions of the speaker's attitudes. So if I say abortion is wrong, for instance, I mean nothing more than I disapprove of abortion. If I say giving to charity is right, this means I approve of giving to charity. So in general, to say X is good or X is right or X is permissible just means I approve of X. To say X is wrong or bad or forbidden means I disapprove of X. I disapprove of X. Now this position is very similar to emotivism. However, I have tried to be clear that emotivism and individualist subjectivism are distinct positions. According to the emotivist, moral statements merely express one's attitudes. They're like smiles or shrieks of pain, right? Whereas according to the individualist subjectivist, moral statements describe one's attitudes. And since moral statements are descriptions, they express beliefs. They can be true or false. Remember, the emotivist says that abortion is wrong basically just means boo to abortion. And boo to abortion can't be true or false. For the individualist subjectivist, it means I disapprove of abortion, and that's a descriptive statement. That can be true or false, because there's a fact of the matter whether you disapprove of abortion or not. Boo to abortion can only be, misleading or not misleading. It can't be. You can't assign any truth value to that. It's not a proposition. Anyway, obviously, individualist subjectivism is a relativist position. It's relativist because the truth of moral statements is relative to the individuals who make them. Abortion is wrong is true for me, just in case I do in fact disapprove of abortion. It's false for you if you don't disapprove of abortion. Emotivism isn't technically relativist, because emotivists don't think that moral judgments are true or false in any way whatsoever. But like emotivism, on individualist subjectivism, no one person's attitudes is more right or privileged than anybody else's. There are simply different attitudes. So I've been emphasising the difference between emotivism and this view for a few videos now, and it might seem like pointless hair splitting. Does it really matter whether we say that moral judgments are expressions of our attitudes or that they're descriptions of our attitudes? Well, yes, it does matter. There's one big benefit that individualist subjectivism has over emotivism. It seems that it doesn't face the Frege-Geach problem or Jorgensen's dilemma. So recall that the Frege-Geach problem is the problem that if moral statements merely express emotional attitudes, then it seems that the meaning of moral statements changes in unasserted contexts. So this poses a serious problem for arguments, for example, like this argument here. As we saw, it seems that on emotivism, the meanings of the different parts of this argument change. So murder is wrong is asserted in premise 2, so it means boo to murder. But it's unasserted in the first premise. If it means anything, I'm not sure if it does mean anything, but it surely doesn't mean boo to murder. So the meaning of murder is wrong changes from one premise to the next, which means the argument is simply an equivocation. It's a straightforward fallacy. Obviously, any other moral argument is going to face the same problem. Jorgensen's dilemma is closely related. Even aside from the problem that the meaning of murder is wrong changes, it's an essential part of the emotivist view that murder is wrong has no truth value. Now, the problem here is that logical validity is standardly defined in terms of truth preservation. The conclusion of an argument follows from the premises just in case the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. That's what validity is. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true too. But if the emotivist is right, the premises and conclusion of this argument, and every other moral argument, are not even candidates for truth or falsity. They're not. There's just not the kind of things that you can even talk about true and false. So the argument just isn't valid. Okay, that was very brief. But if any of it was confusing, just go back to the earlier video on emotivism. The point here is that individualist subjectivism doesn't face these problems, because individualist subjectivism can reconstruct the argument like this. If I disapprove of murder, then I disapprove of paying to murder. I disapprove of murder. Therefore, I disapprove of paying to murder. Now, I disapprove of murder has truth value. It's either true or false, and its meaning doesn't change in unasserted contexts. Now, there's a sense in which its meaning changes. When you say, I disapprove of murder, you're asserting your disapproval of murder. And when you say something like, if I disapprove of murder, then I disapprove of paying somebody to murder, you're not asserting your disapproval of murder. So in that sense, yes, it does change in meaning. But with I disapprove of murder, whether it's asserted or unasserted, it has the same truth conditions. This statement is either true or false, and we know what would make it true or false, regardless of whether you're asserting it or not. It has the same literal meaning. It's not fundamentally different from any other belief statement. So I disapprove of murder is like saying the earth is not flat, or the moon is made of cheese. So if you consider the two statements, the moon is made of cheese, on the one hand, and on the other, if the moon is made of cheese, then the moon is edible. Obviously, I'm expressing something different with each statement. The moon is made of cheese is asserted in the first, but not in the second, but its meaning remains constant. So anyway, individualist subjectivism doesn't face these two problems, and for that reason we might think that it's an improvement on emotivism, because it's it's basically the same idea of emotivism, but by allowing truth and falsity, we avoid these two difficulties. So let's turn to some problems for the theory. First of all, individualist subjectivism has a serious problem accounting for moral disagreement. If I say abortion is wrong, I mean I disapprove of abortion. If you say abortion is acceptable, you mean I approve of abortion. But notice that in this case, you're not really disagreeing with me. You're simply changing the subject. My statement was about my own attitudes, your statement was about your attitudes. We've seen this problem of disagreement before in the context of emotivism, but I think it's even worse for the individualist subjectivist. Because the emotivist, remember, can allow that moral statements express disagreement in attitude. For the emotivist, I'm saying boo to abortion, whereas you're saying yay to abortion. Your moral statements, the moral statements each express different attitudes to abortion. So there's a real sense in which there's a disagreement here. We're expressing this disagreement in attitude. But for the individualist subjectivist, I'm merely reporting my attitudes. And how could you disagree with that? As long as you think I'm speaking honestly, you agree with me. Now, of course, obviously, it's the case that we do in fact have a disagreement in attitude. My disapproval of abortion, your approval of it. But the important point is that for the subjectivist, this disagreement is never actually expressed by moral statements, because all you're doing when you make a moral statement is giving a straightforward factual report. If I accept that you're being honest, that you're describing your views accurately, then I have to agree with you. I have to grant that your statement is true, even if I have a different attitude. So it doesn't really seem to leave room for any real moral disagreement. This is perhaps related to a second problem, that individualist subjectivism doesn't seem to account for the persuasive force of moral judgments as well as something like emotivism does. Moral judgments have this peculiar force to them, a magnetic quality, if you will, I think is what Charles Stevenson described it as. When we make moral statements, we're often trying to influence people, we're trying to persuade them to change their attitudes and behaviour. To take a non-moral example, compare merely stating in a matter-of-fact way, I don't like how you smell, with a more emotive, ugh, you're gross, whatever. It seems to me that moral statements are more like the second. When you look at the kinds of contexts in which people make moral statements and the uses to which they're put, I think we can see that they kind of have this persuasive, this emotive role that individualist subjectivism doesn't quite capture. Similarly, it does seem that your moral judgments are inextricably tied to your emotive feelings. It's not just a straightforward statement of belief, is it? I don't think it is anyway. At least not when I make moral judgments. I don't think I'm just straightforwardly kind of straightforwardly reporting my attitudes. So it seems that individualist subjectivism might just be wrong about the psychology of morality. Third, individualist subjectivism entails that all our moral judgments are completely infallible. As long as you're expressing yourself honestly, what you say is going to be true. You simply can't be wrong. If you say that you like the taste of chocolate ice cream, you can't be wrong about that. You know your own tastes. You might be lying, but then your statement will be false. But if you honestly assert that you like chocolate ice cream, it would be ridiculous to say that you're factually incorrect. So if moral statements are just descriptions of our own attitudes, we can't be wrong about them. But then it seems very odd to allow this kind of infallibility, to say that all of our judgments in a whole area of discourse are infallible. Notice that this is another problem the emotivist doesn't face, since on emotivism, moral statements are neither true nor false. So the question of whether they're infallible or fallible simply doesn't arise. Finally, I want to mention one objection some people might make, which is, isn't this view just straightforwardly inconsistent? If abortion is wrong is true for me, but false for you, doesn't that mean that abortion is wrong is both true and false? Which of course is simply contradictory. Well, no, it doesn't mean that. This objection is a mistake, but it's a mistake that people might be inclined to make when it comes to relativist views, so let's clear it up. I mentioned earlier the relativity of motion, so this is a good example. Consider two statements. The Earth is not moving and the Earth is moving. Both of these statements are true in one sense and false in another sense. Their truth value is relative to your frame of reference. What we really should say is the Earth is not moving relative to the reference frame of the Earth, and the Earth is moving relative to the reference frame of the Sun, or whatever else. Qualified in this way, they're both true, and without those qualifications, we can't really evaluate the claims. They don't really make sense independently of your reference frame. But notice that once we add the qualifications, the appearance of contradiction disappears. For the individualist subjectivist, moral statements can be given basically the same analysis. We can't really judge a statement like abortion is wrong just in itself. On its own, this statement doesn't even make sense. We have to add the qualification, abortion is wrong for Frank, abortion is not wrong for Vincent, etc. With that said, I think there is still a problem of inconsistency here. Namely, most people's beliefs are probably inconsistent. We all value consistency, but the fact is we're not very good at it. It's very difficult to make sure that all of your beliefs fit together correctly. Even professional philosophers who spend their careers thinking very hard about their own beliefs fall into inconsistency often enough. So Frank might strongly believe that abortion is always wrong, but then he might have other moral principles that entail that it's sometimes acceptable. If we accept individualist subjectivism, it looks like we have to say that for Frank, abortion is both always wrong and sometimes not wrong, which is a straightforward contradiction. There can be true contradictions. Emotivism obviously deals with these cases better, since if moral judgments are neither true nor false, they can't be contradictory. For the emotivist, Frank simply has what we might call a fractured sensibility. I think that's a phrase used by Simon Blackburn, but it wouldn't be a contradiction. I'm not sure how the individualist subjectivist could avoid the conclusion that there literally are true contradictions, and we might take this as a fairly powerful point in favour of emotivism. Okay. Anyway, the point about motion allows the individualist subjectivist to deal with another fairly obvious objection. Recall the last video, Mackey's argument that moral judgments include a claim to objectivity. It seems that when we make a moral judgment, like abortion is wrong, we mean that abortion is wrong. We don't mean abortion is wrong for me. However, notice that the same was once true about statements about motion. In fact, even today, when I say, for example, we are going at 20 miles per hour, that seems to include an assumption that the statement is non-relative. Certainly in the past, this statement would have been taken at face value. We're going at 20 miles per hour, and that's that. You're just wrong if you disagree with that. When we discovered that motion is actually relative, so we're going at 20 miles per hour can only be true relative to a particular reference frame, we didn't conclude that all those statements about motion were just false. We said, well, they're true, but they're true relative to a particular reference frame. So the individualist subjectivist and later the cultural subjectivist, they can accept that when we make moral statements, we don't usually think of them as being relative to an individual or culture, but this doesn't mean that they aren't relative to an individual or culture, just as is the case with motion. A final point that I'd make is I've been comparing individualist subjectivism to emotivism quite a lot here, and they are very similar. Now, the vast majority of philosophers who are inclined to this kind of view, this kind of non-objectivist type view, seem to prefer emotivism. Emotivism seems to be regarded as an obvious improvement on individualist subjectivism. And in fact, historically, individualist subjectivism came first. Emotivism was a later development. To be honest, I'm not really sure why this kind of attitude holds. I'm not aware of any obvious knockdown argument that favours emotivism over individualist subjectivism. As we've seen, emotivism does do better than individualist subjectivism in some ways, but then individualist subjectivism doesn't face the Frege-Geach problem. So, you have to decide for yourself. But I just think it's interesting that historically it seems that emotivism kind of has, it just seems to be regarded as clearly an improvement, even among philosophers who don't accept either of them. They seem to think that emotivism is clearly an improvement. But as I say, I'm not really aware that there is any kind of obvious argument that favours emotivism. Okay, anyway, let's look at cultural subjectivism. So on individualist subjectivism, the truth value of moral statements is relative to the individuals who make them. According to cultural subjectivism, the truth value of moral statements is relative to the individual's culture. Moral statements are really about the broader cultural attitudes and values. So, abortion is wrong means that the speaker's culture disapproves of abortion. These days, this kind of view seems to be kind of popular among certain people. It's more commonly known as cultural relativism. It is a relativist theory. I'm calling it cultural subjectivism for the reason I mentioned earlier, and to keep the terminology uniform. Okay, so what are the benefits of cultural subjectivism? Well, first, cultural subjectivism is in many ways more in accord with our intuitions than any of the other views we've seen so far. Unlike individualist subjectivism, it allows for genuine, real moral disagreement, because it's an empirical matter what a culture believes. There are facts about whether or not abortion, for example, is accepted in a culture. So if moral statements express cultural values, then we can be right or wrong when we make moral statements. I can substantially disagree with you. In fact, there's more than this. This is just a symptom, really, of a broader. This is an upshot of a broader point. Cultural subjectivism places morality, in a sense, outside of ourselves. It's something outside of the individual. It's about more than just my own feelings. Since morality is a product of the wider culture, it's not just up to me what's morally right or wrong. And there are two benefits to taking this kind of view. First, many people do generally feel that morality is something more than their own feelings. The cultural subjectivist can say that's because it's about the feelings of the entire culture. You have to account for a bunch of whole other people. So the cultural subjectivist can explain this intuition that morality is something more than us. Obviously, if you're an individualist subjectivist or an emotivist, you'd have to say that intuition is just wrong. Secondly, it gives us room for a really robust degree of rationality and justification concerning morality. We can really evaluate moral claims through evidence and argument. And this is something new. None of the other views that we've looked at so far allow for this. For emotivism and individualist subjectivism, moral statements concern the attitudes of the speaker. For the error theorist, moral claims are universally false. In all these cases, the practice of justifying moral claims, showing that moral claims are rational or whatever, it looks to be a waste of time. But clearly the cultural subjectivist can make room for this. Now, of course, whether it gives the right kind of rationality and justification is questionable, and we'll look at objections to it in a bit. But the point is that here we have a view on which some moral claims are true, and the truth doesn't just depend on your own personal feelings. So you should be able to see why some people find this appealing. It clearly gives morality a more sort of substantial grounding than any of the views we've looked at so far. Okay, so I think one of the main reasons people find cultural subjectivism appealing is that they feel it's necessary for sort of tolerance and respect of other cultures. So most of us in the modern world feel that it's important to be understanding of other cultures. We can't just assume that everyone should be like us. We have to respect different lifestyles, different ways of living in the world. Consider different funeral rituals. There are some small-scale societies that will burn dead bodies and then eat the ashes. I think the Yanomamo do that. And this seems pretty bizarre to us, and maybe to us it seems deeply disrespectful to the person who's died. If somebody from our culture ate the ashes of a dead person, we might find that very offensive. But if that's the practice of another culture, it just seems very arrogant. Very arrogant and insensitive to come along and say, no, you're wrong, you have to stop doing that. So we can't just assume that our way of living is the one correct way of living. And cultural subjectivism, I think many people feel that it kind of accommodates this, because on cultural subjectivism, there is no absolute right or wrong culture. There are just different cultures. So that seems to leave this room for tolerance and respect. This is a very poor argument. Don't make this argument. It's crap. The problem here is that cultural subjectivism is just too broad. It allows too much. Remember, the cultural subjectivist says that what make moral claims true are the attitudes of the culture. But a culture can have all sorts of attitudes. What if you live in a culture that doesn't value tolerance? If you live in a culture that says, no, we shouldn't be tolerant of other cultures, we should expand our empire and impose our values on others, with the sword, become like us or die. Well, if the truth of moral claims is determined by the culture, then that is indeed what your society should do. For you and for others in your culture, tolerance is wrong. If you act in tolerant ways, you're behaving immorally. So the simple fact is that cultural subjectivism doesn't really support tolerance. In fact, in some ways it undermines it, because there are many cultures that are intolerant, and their beliefs are true for them. A person who accepts a non-relativist metaethics is in a better position here, because they can say that tolerance is some sort of universal value. But even aside from this point, there's the question of, what should tolerance involve? Does tolerating another society mean that you have to accept everything that the other society does? Surely not. I mean, I can tolerate a society while still criticising some of their practices, right? Indeed, in many ways, criticism is an important part of tolerance and respect. Consider that we don't make negative moral judgments about the behaviour of very young children. We probably wouldn't say that a 2-year-old child can do anything morally wrong. We might tell them off, to help them learn, but we can't really hold them morally responsible for anything. Now imagine treating an adult this way. Wouldn't that be just kind of insulting? I mean, if you respect somebody and consider them intelligent and rational, and you consider them to be some extent your peer, then you should criticise them if they do things that you think are wrong. Surely the same is the case for other societies. So tolerating a society doesn't mean that we can't say some of their practices are wrong. If anything, it means we should criticise them. Refraining from criticising them would be to treat them like children. So the very kind of idea of this argument, the whole basis of it, this is just not a very good way of approaching things in my view. And in any case, we should keep in mind what we're really interested in here, or at least what I'm interested in here. These are my videos, so let's keep in mind what I'm interested in, which is the truth, the facts. Even if cultural subjectivism does encourage tolerance for other societies, this has nothing to do with whether it's correct or not. And we're looking for the correct account of the meaning of moral judgments. So on all counts, this kind of argument is completely unpersuasive. A slightly better argument begins by looking at the nature of moral claims. We saw this a bit in the last video with Mackey's argument from relativity. When we examine other cultures, we find a significant amount of moral disagreement, and the best explanation for this disagreement is that there are no objective moral values. We already looked at this in the last video, so I won't go over it again. Let's just accept, for the sake of argument, that there are no objective moral values. Mackey, as we saw, used this to support the error theory, but there are ways to take this in a different direction. The cultural subjectivist can say, let's take a look at what morality actually is. Morality arises out of the need for social cooperation. Humans have lots of selfish tendencies, and we need to keep these in check. We need systems in place for making sure that people can work together and society can remain orderly and coherent. And one important way of achieving this is to mould people's attitudes. Make them feel that certain things must be done, certain things must not be done, and so on. This helps to maintain social harmony. But importantly, there's no single right way to do this. There's no single set of rules that will keep society harmonious. So what we have is that morality is a system developed in cultures to help organise behaviour, and there are many ways of doing this, many different kinds of morality that work. This is a descriptive claim. This is just what morality literally is. So given that this is what morality actually is, then of course the truth or falsity of moral statements is dependent on the attitudes of the culture. How could it be otherwise? What else could moral truth be based on? Maybe an analogy would be helpful. Consider something like money. How much are these two coins worth? £2, right? That's £2 coins. Now, why are they worth £2? Well, it's clearly not an objective fact. It's not somehow written into the structure of the universe that these two bits of metal are worth £2. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to be a mere matter of individual opinion. If I say those coins are worth £3, surely my statement is just false. They're worth £2, not £3. I wouldn't be able to buy something worth £3 with those two coins. So why are they worth £2? Well, simply because that's what the culture has decided. Money is something developed by a culture to help facilitate various kinds of transactions and so on. How much a particular coin is worth is simply decided by the culture. There's nothing more to it than that. It's just what they are worth, what the culture says they're worth. Now, if morality is like money, in that it's simply something developed to help maintain social order, it's just a cultural development, why would our account of it be any different? Okay, moral values are just what the culture says they are, because morality is just something developed by a culture, like money is developed to help people get by, basically. There's a more general argument for cultural subjectivism that's worth mentioning. The last argument is specifically concerned with moral claims. It makes this assumption that there's a difference between moral claims and empirical claims in a kind of important respect. Moral claims arise from the culture, whereas empirical claims are more neutral and can be evaluated independently of the culture. Now, there is an argument which is popular among postmodernists that truth, rationality, justification, knowledge, and so on are all relative to cultures or to conceptual frameworks as well. This kind of view denies that there's a significant difference between empirical claims and moral claims, but then, rather than adopt a realism about morality, it says both moral claims and empirical claims are culturally relative. I'm not going to explore this here because it would just be a massive tangent. In order to explain these kinds of views properly, I'd need to do a whole other video series. But if you're interested, pick up a book on philosophy of science. People like Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend were big influences on this sort of approach. The point here is just that if you accept that all claims in general, the truth of all claims in general is relative to one's culture, then a fortiori the truth of moral claims is relative to one's culture. So this is another approach that you could take if you are so inclined. Alright, so some problems. One of the primary objections to cultural subjectivism is that it seems to eliminate the possibility of justified moral reform. Suppose you live in a culture that believes that homosexuality is wrong and should be punished. Well, if that's what your culture believes, then it's true, at least for everybody in that culture, that homosexuality is wrong and that homosexuals should be punished. Now, if you're a moral reformer, if you disagree with the consensus and say, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality, according to cultural subjectivism, your beliefs are simply false. You are just wrong. So cultural subjectivism seems to demand a kind of blind obedience to whatever values your society happens to have. It's very simple. If your moral values don't align with the norms of your culture, you're just wrong, and that's that. Because the truth value of moral statements is determined by the culture. So if you don't agree with them, you're wrong. This is a pretty serious problem. But I think there are a couple of things we can say in defence of the cultural subjectivist. Two points that kind of diffuse this, I think. First of all, we have to bear in mind that many moral disagreements are empirical. For example, the radical difference in status between men and women in the past was based on the belief that men are more rational and intelligent than women. This is an empirical claim. So the idea is that we can enact moral reform by attacking this empirical claim. If we show that women are just as rational and intelligent as men are, then the justification for treating them differently is lost. So, similarly, many people have justified discrimination against homosexuals by arguing that homosexuality leads to paedophilia and child abuse. Now, we now know that that is simply false. It doesn't lead to any such thing, so that clearly undermines the justification for discrimination. I mean, similarly, it was widely held in the past that non-human animals have no mental states. Non-human animals are mere automata, little robots. A dog will shriek if you kick it, but this is nothing more than a mechanical reaction. Human bodies are mechanical too, of course, but humans are unique in that we have non-physical souls. Our souls are the seat of consciousness and a part of our ability to feel pain and pleasure. Animals don't have souls, so they don't feel pain. Because of this, it wasn't believed that there was anything wrong with treating animals however we wished. So, scientists could perform experiments on live animals, vivisection and so on. These days, this has changed. We recognise that there are certain basic animal rights. Arguably, this didn't happen because of a change of values. It's just that most people no longer believe in non-physical souls. We think the brain is responsible for many of our mental states, and we know that animals have brains reasonably like ours, so it's a reasonable supposition that they can feel pain. Our values didn't change. We always believed that inflicting pain was wrong, but our beliefs about the kinds of beings who could be subject to pain change. So that's an example of a change in moral value caused by a change of empirical belief. And examples like that can be multiplied easily. The point is that moral values are often influenced and justified by empirical beliefs. So, yes, the cultural subjectivist has to grant that his culture's moral values are not wrong, but he may insist that the empirical beliefs influencing or justifying them are wrong, and in this way moral reform can be encouraged. The second point is that values often conflict. There are certain things we all value, such as consistency. Now, if a culture values consistency, and certain views can be shown to be inconsistent, then we can encourage change. Suppose, for example, that a society both values freedom and autonomy, but is also in favour of imprisoning homosexuals. Well, we might say, look, surely imprisoning somebody for engaging in homosexual activity is incompatible with these deeper values of respecting freedom and autonomy. And this is actually how a lot of cultural change actually happens. Societies have constitutions which express the basic rights and values of that society, and if a law can be shown to be inconsistent with these, it will be overthrown. Okay, so this is not completely implausible. This is how things really do. This is how change really does happen. And these 2 points kind of allow cultural subjectivists not just to suggest that moral reform can be justified. These 2 points also allow them to rebut a sort of standard criticism. It's often pointed out that cultural subjectivism entails that terrible acts like the Holocaust are perfectly acceptable. What the Nazis did was perfectly fine from their own culture. We might not like the Holocaust, but that's just our culture. If you were living in Nazi Germany, you should have supported it. What the cultural subjectivist can say here is, well, first, the Nazis' hatred of the Jews was based on faulty empirical beliefs. There are publications like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which spread anti-Semitic propaganda, but a lot of what was said in those publications was just factually wrong. So the empirical beliefs underlying the kind of moral judgment were faulty. And second, the Nazis violated more fundamental standards of their own culture. Yes, they were deeply anti-Semitic, but the rest of their behaviour showed that they, like everyone else, understood the importance of, for example, respecting a basic right to life. Indeed, notice that the Nazis actually did, they instituted reforms regarding the treatment of animals. I think they had some of the strictest laws in the world to protect animal welfare. So we might say, this kind of thing just betrays the fact that the German people at the time did believe it was important to have a basic respect for life, and so on. So the cultural subjectivist does have the resources for arguing that the actions of the Nazis were wrong. And in this, cultural subjectivism is more in line with our intuitions than all the other views we've examined. For the first time, we have a way to justify rationally our feeling that the Nazis were wrong. None of the other views we've looked at would be able to make any room for this. Now, of course, we can debate whether this kind of argument can really capture the depths of the evil of something like the Holocaust. but at the very least, contrary to the objection noted earlier, it looks like cultural subjectivism can allow for justified moral reform, and it can allow us to say that some things, really were just wrong. It looks like it can accommodate those things. Nevertheless, I suppose there are two things we have to bear in mind at this point. First, it's still the case that if we take, for instance, a person who thinks that homosexuality is acceptable in a culture that believes that homosexuality is morally wrong and should be punished by death, that person is just incorrect. Their moral beliefs are false. Now, it may be that the homophobia of his culture is based on faulty empirical views. It may be that their homophobia is inconsistent with other values. But ultimately, if that culture believes that homosexuality is morally wrong, then homosexuality really is wrong for anybody in that culture. So reform might be rationally justified, but it can't be rationally compelled. You must bear in mind that the moral reformers' views are simply incorrect insofar as they don't match the mainstream cultural views. And I suppose another point about moral reform is, there's a danger in that if you appeal to something like inconsistency, then the reform might just go in the opposite direction. So you can say, well, our discrimination of homosexuals is inconsistent with our respecting freedom. So the culture might solve that by coming to respect homosexuals and stop discriminating against them. But it might solve it by just saying, well, actually, we don't care about freedom. So there's a danger here. Cultural subjectivism doesn't quite, I suppose, say everything that people might want to say about moral reform, and so on. But secondly, and this I suppose is the more important point, the fact is that people often simply don't care whether something is conventionally considered right or wrong. I mean, it just seems uncharitable to interpret a person with radical moral views in the way that the cultural subjectivist suggests. Consider, for instance, Peter Singer. According to Peter Singer, infanticide is sometimes justifiable. It's sometimes okay, says Peter Singer, to kill newborn babies if they have certain very severe disabilities that would cause them to have very short, painful lives, and if the parents, are both kind of fully informed and they all agree. He thinks it's okay to kill them rather than let them live. This is a very radical claim. Now, the cultural subjectivist says that when Peter Singer says that infanticide is sometimes acceptable, what this means is something like, according to Western culture, infanticide is sometimes morally acceptable, or according to Australians, infanticide is sometimes morally acceptable, because Peter Singer is an Australian. And basically, this is just a very implausible and uncharitable way to interpret Singer, because those statements, the statement that according to Western culture infanticide is sometimes morally acceptable, is obviously false. Nobody would defend claims like that. The idea that infanticide is morally acceptable, that would be considered to be shocking and repugnant by the vast majority of Western people. And it seems pretty obvious that Peter Singer is well aware of this. He knows that he's going against the grain. So when he argues that infanticide is sometimes morally acceptable, he's obviously not trying to convince us that most people believe that infanticide is sometimes morally acceptable. That's obviously not what he's doing. So to sum up then, we saw that one of the benefits of cultural subjectivism over individualist subjectivism is that it allows for substantial moral disagreement. It allows that moral claims can be subject to rational justification. Unfortunately, it seems that its account of moral disagreement and moral justification is just completely wrong. I mean, it's simply it's completely removed from how people actually engage in moral discourse. That Peter Singer example is not unusual. When you advance an unconventional moral claim, you generally know perfectly well that it's unconventional, and you don't care. You're not simply trying to describe cultural attitudes. So I think that cultural subjectivism just gets this wrong, and I'm not really sure how to avoid this. Anyway, possibly the most serious problem for cultural subjectivism is, how exactly do we define a culture? What's my culture, for instance? Well, we might say it's to do with the place that you were born. But then where do we draw the line? I was born in Cornwall, UK. So do we say that my culture is Cornish or English or British or European? How fine-grained should our classifications be? I was born in a particular hospital in a particular city. Do we go that fine-grained? I mean, I assume we wouldn't go that fine-grained, but exactly where to draw the line is not clear. And in any case, there seem to be other things that are important. What about religion, for instance? It seems to me that different religious groups can create different ways of life, even in the same country. Social class makes a big difference. Is somebody who's sort of earning millions and millions of pounds, do they really have the same culture as me? I'm not sure that they do. A person's career, that's important. Can we say of a CEO that person has the same culture as somebody, working as a waitress? What about differences in race, differences in gender, even? Can these sorts of things make a difference? Even different fashions and lifestyles, goth, hippie, punk, could they be different cultures? I mean, we do often describe them at least as subcultures, so can that make a moral difference? The point is, I'm very sceptical that there's a non-arbitrary way to define the different cultural divisions. But if we're going to say that what makes moral statements true are the attitudes of the culture, then we really need to provide some sort of answer here. And I just don't see how it could be done. And notice that even if it could be done, cultures overlap. There are no fixed groups. There will always be people who live in more than one culture. Most obviously, if you have, first generation immigrants from one country to another, something like that, they surely are tied to more than one culture. Maybe their two cultures might be very, very radically different. I suppose one response to these problems might be to say, okay, there are lots of overlapping cultures, there are lots of ways of dividing up a culture, but maybe we can just accept all this and say that all of these different cultures generate different moralities. The problem with this, of course, is that we get completely chaotic and contradictory results. In fact, I'd say it just becomes impossible to apply in practice. So if you take abortion, in order to determine whether or not abortion is wrong, I'd have to ask, what does my Cornish culture say about abortion? What does my English culture say about it? What does British culture say about it? What does European culture say about it? And that's just the places. I then got to consider all of these other things, all of these other kind of cultural attachments that I have. This is obviously hopeless. We need to come up with a principled way of dividing up different cultures. But the fact is that we don't have that, and we probably never will. There are further problems here. Let's suppose that we do figure out a way to divide up cultures. The next question is, who exactly counts as the authority on what a particular culture believes? Are a culture's moral views simply a matter of the number of people who believe them, or are some people more important than others? For example, imagine that 60% of people in a particular culture support the death penalty. So 60% of all the people in it support the death penalty. But now imagine that 90% of the people in authority, the people in charge of the culture, are against the death penalty and have been for a long time. We can imagine a country where the average layperson supports the death penalty, but whose leaders are committed in opposition to the death penalty. And it's actually been written into the constitution that the state of this country is not allowed to execute people. This is hardly far-fetched. This, I think, is perhaps a bit more exaggerated, but essentially describes the situation in the UK. I think, I might be wrong, that the majority of people in the UK support the death penalty, but the vast majority of people, the sort of leaders, the political leaders, are against it. So that's not a crazy example. The question is, does this culture support the death penalty, or is it opposed to it? How do we come to an answer here? I will notice, incidentally, that these same problems will occur for other terms that we might substitute for culture. Traditions, practices, ways of life, all of these are just as difficult to define. So something like a tradition subjectivism or a way of life subjectivism would have precisely the same problems here. Okay, finally, it's worth noting that cultural subjectivism, like individual subjectivism, has problems of inconsistency. However we end up defining a culture, however we choose who the authority of a culture is, cultural beliefs are surely sometimes inconsistent, just as an individual's beliefs are. In fact, we saw earlier that this was in some ways a positive thing, since it provides room for moral reform. But it's philosophically unwelcome, since it does leave us with contradictions. There are going to be cases where it might be, for instance, forbidden for a person to have an abortion and permissible for them to have an abortion. So we end up having to countenance true contradictions, and a lot of people are rather uncomfortable with that. Right, well, that's the end of that. Next time we'll look at some non-relativist forms of subjectivism, but that's all for today. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.